Chapter 7. Brenda did not moon over the young man, but her interest had been piqued. Except for Tony the lifeguard, she had a deep and abiding distrust of the male sex. "I hate him," she whispered violently under her breath every night, feeling the disgust of her father looming over her naked body in the darkness, his features distorted and bloated as he buried his face in her breast, then depleted himself within her. Yes, she thought, I hate him, and the him referred both to her father and to the male race from which he sprang. No matter how friendly they are, they all eventually want the same thing. No matter what happens, I won't let any of them touch me. There was a degree of comfort as she repeated this vow after lunch, but the sight of the magnificent stranger was not diminished. That afternoon, Brenda rose to get a breath of fresh air and to inhale the wondrous fragrance of the tide coming in. She squinted as she stepped outside the barracks, smoothing back her hair as the long silken strands whipped her face. She followed a snake-like thread of water that widened into Naha Harbor. It was a benjo ditch, an open sewer, but it led to a moss-covered basalt rock just behind the office. This was one of Brenda's secret places, a knoll that overlooked Oruku Peninsula and Naha Airfield. She gazed out into the deep blue shimmer of the South China Sea, watching the lapping of the azure water and the endless beds of coral just beneath it. Fishermen often waded out a quarter of a mile, rolling their pants legs above their knees. Her glimmering blue-green eyes surveyed the breathtaking beauty of the overlook. Her eyes seemed to absorb the color of the ocean itself. She saw the green of the ironwood trees and tall pines, the fragrance of blossoming red hibiscus and azaleas that marked the beginning of the Uchitamari Ridge. Her hair was an immense mass of flowing blonde, all tendrils and glitter in the sunlight. Brenda had left her grandparents' house only 6 years before, but she had the look of a mature woman now. Her breasts tugged at the deep V of her white cotton blouse, exposing her marble throat. Brenda leaned against the rock with her hands behind her, gazing out to sea, as if waiting for something mysterious and far in the future. She possessed grandeur and a kind of classic grace. The girl did not know that she was beautiful and striking to the point of perfection. Her feet, and the broken brogans handed down from Dorothy, were crossed at the ankles. Her old skirt was too short, and her smooth calves were covered in ridiculous thick white stockings, but neither of these could dim the perfect contour of her figure. Because she was so unusual, she was detested and avoided by the other girls, the popular girls, who were all the same and as undifferentiated as the kernels on a cob of corn. She was singular and uncommon in face, body, and movement, and so she awakened enmity among the uniform, who could endure no variance, no distinguishing characteristics. Brenda's very innocence was an affront to those who were not innocent. She was suspected of vileness and corruption precisely because she ignored loud whispers and sly smiles. Nonetheless, she heard them and cringed in her soul because of it. She closed her eyes and tried to think of something nice, like that man she met today, James Thomas. He certainly seemed kind. I hope we can be friends, Brenda said to herself, and her face lit up at the thought. Do I love him? She asked herself, trudging back up the path to the white frame building with the 5th Corps insignia emblazoned upon it. She puzzled over this thought, then dismissed it utterly. Of course not. Who can know love, whom love has not known? She opened the screen door to the building, smiling at the irony of the song blaring through the entryway. I am no better, and neither are you. We are the same, whatever we do. You love me, you hate me, you know me, and then you can't figure out the bag I'm in. There is no such thing as everyday people, she thought, remembering her daddy. Brenda shuddered, clenching her alabaster arms close to her bosom as she rolled her swivel chair over to the window. She had not noticed the tall blonde soldier on her way back to the building. He leaned against his delivery van, smoking a cigarette, as she made her way back along the path. When Brenda disappeared inside, the man snubbed out the cigarette, tossing it to the ground. "Hey, James, come on. We've been sitting here all afternoon waiting for you. We've got 3 more deliveries to make." "I'm coming," James Thomas said, swinging up into the truck and starting the engine. The sun was low in the west when the truck lumbered into the motor pool garage. James checked in and walked into an office identical to Brenda's. The girl behind the desk smiled as James approached. "Carolyn, could I see you for a minute?" James said airily. "Sure, James. I'll get off work in 20 minutes. How about Lynn Chang's?" Carolyn Crosby replied. "Great," James answered. "I'll meet you there." He relished the fresh sea air outside, glad to be away from the army barracks that always stank of sweat. He walked briskly along Koza Boulevard, swinging his arms vigorously. This was James' customary manner when deeply engrossed in thought. Meeting the new girl, Brenda Campbell, was as shattering an experience for James as it was for her. He paced the streets of Naha in a rush, turning the same question over in his mind. Who is that astounding girl on Bradley Avenue? At the appointed time, James entered Lynn Chang's, his eyes smarting from the dark interior of the place. In a moment he made out Carolyn's silhouette at a table. "Thanks for coming," James said, placing his palm gently on her shoulder. "Thank you, James," the girl replied, covering his hand with her own. The warmth in Carolyn's voice betrayed a deep regard for her friend. "James? Are you all right? You look like you've been running up and down the street in a mad rush." "I'm fine, Carol," James replied, smoothing his disheveled hair. "How's my best buddy from high school?" "Ah, cut it out, Carol. You know it's been a long time since high school. You know how things change." "You mean you found somebody special?" the girl asked, her eyebrows raised. "Yeah, I'm afraid, I think so." Carolyn leaned back in her chair, opening her handbag and reaching for a cigarette. "Well, can you tell me about her? You and I never kept secrets, did we? She must be pretty special to have you this upset." James leaned forward on the tiny stool, his eyes closed as in meditation. "I don't quite know how to describe her. Her name is Brenda. She has light brown hair and blue eyes. She has a kind of serene look. It's as if she hasn't a care in the world. I feel drawn to her, and I think she feels the same way towards me. It bugs me to get involved so fast. I don't understand." Carolyn sipped her drink, choosing her words carefully. "James, maybe you should let things happen one at a time. Sometimes these things are meant to be, and you can't tell. I think if this relationship is meant to be, it will grow on its own." "If I had one, I'd show you a picture of her," James said quietly. "Then you could see how beautiful she really is." "Well, James, I hope everything works out with Brenda. If you need to talk, just call. You know my number." James sat unmoved in his melancholy. Carolyn rose, and James recovered long enough to rise with her and hold her briefly in a farewell hug. "Thanks for listening, Carol. I'll see you later, promise." Carolyn hoped he would accompany her to the door, but he sat in his chair, lost in his all-consuming thoughts. Carolyn looked at her burdened companion, silhouetted against the fluorescent glare of the bar. "Poor James," she muttered under her breath, stepping out into the brilliant sunlit street. Weeks later, Carolyn and James met again to discuss Brenda Campbell. James had a picture. The girl in the picture looked young, maybe 15, dressed all in white. The overall effect was striking. The girl had shoulder-length hair, parted in the middle. The face was pleasant to look at, with none of the irregularities common with adolescence. The lips were parted, the face in an attitude of rapt attention. The nose was prominent and aristocratic. The eyes gazed across the table with an overpowering sense of peace and self-possession. Carolyn noticed that the object of the girl's attention at the other end of the photo was James himself. Yes, Carolyn mused, they were made for each other. If the gods allowed love at first sight, this was it. James believed the girl was troubled in some way, but in her face all troubles had been assimilated into something good and wonderful. The only hint was a sadness around the eyes. James did not know Brenda's dreadful secret, the dark thing she had scarcely hinted to her friend Ellie. That information had yet to be revealed, had yet to be mirrored in that face, which was James' constant delight. James' normal deliveries to the Fifth Corps compound were made twice a week, yet miraculously he began appearing there on a daily basis. It was not for many weeks that Brenda stumbled upon his secret strategy. He would pay other drivers to let him run their loads to Brenda's building. Every day James asked for a date, but she refused, making various excuses. "I can't go out with you," she would say. "I have lots of work to do at home." The brief conversations James managed were infuriatingly short. Brenda never failed to smile, but she refused to see him after hours. This puzzled James, for he saw the growing interest in Brenda's eyes, the lilt in her voice when he arrived. Surely she felt a growing affection, as he did. Why did she refuse him? Obviously a severe case of shyness. He knew he wanted this girl. Now it only remained to force the issue. One morning in late August, he found his opportunity. As usual, James presented his delivery slip at Brenda's desk. "So, it's you again," Brenda said, looking up. James saw the glimmer of hope in her eyes, and he grinned. "Did I tell you I get this Friday off?" Brenda methodically stamped and recorded his documents, ignoring the remark until she finished. "You know I can't go out with you. I've got work." I know. You've got chores to do at home for your family of 8, James interjected, his face clouding with anger. "But why can't we at least have lunch together like you always—" He stopped himself abruptly. She couldn't know he watched her eat lunch every day at 12 o'clock. I know they give you a lunch break around here." "What do you say?" Brenda looked at him, a line of thoughtfulness creasing her forehead. Louis might see them together, for the bakery was only 3 blocks away. James spoke louder, incurring the interest of several clerks nearby. "Miss Campbell, I implore you, consider having lunch with this poor lad you see. I can't live without you." His theatrics were having the desired effect. James dropped to one knee in mock humility. "Please, love of my life, if I must, I will marry you, but don't force me to have lunch without the pleasure of your company." Brenda had been embarrassed. Now her flushed face went incandescent as she heard Sergeant Abercrombie behind her. "Campbell, as your immediate supervisor, I order you to have lunch with this deserving young man, no later than 1300 hours today." He smiled broadly, with a wink at James beyond. "Thank you, sir," James responded with a smart salute, and he turned on his heel. "See you at 1, Brenda," James called out loudly, striding out the doorway to the steaming daylight beyond. Brenda felt the whole office giggling behind her back. Her face burned with anger? Indignation? She did not know. She flipped open another folder on her desk. Her mind wandered over the miles of excuses she had used so many times before. "He is kind," she said inwardly. "Why should I feel strange at the thought of being with him?" She turned another page. Every day James had entered the dispatch shack, and Brenda would stare wistfully at him, imagining a relationship that at once lured and repelled her. Brenda wanted to be with him, for he knew an awesome world she did not know. On the other hand, his life was not her life. She was a stranger to his world, though he could enter hers easily. He had a car. He left work every day and went as his heart desired. Brenda could sense the freedom in his soul. He had no Margot, no Louis Campbell waiting for him at every turn. He knew hundreds of people like himself, but she knew only him. He was her lifeline to reality. What would happen if he should leave forever? Brenda clenched her fist tightly at the thought, then relaxed it. Of course he would leave. Why bother? Eventually he would tire of coming. He would forget, but she would not forget. He would go, and she would be left behind. But please, God, she thought, let him be near me just a little longer. Still, in all, he was a man, and that convicted him in Brenda's eyes. Yet to her consternation, Brenda found her willpower to resist weakening each time James spoke to her. Now, the unthinkable had happened. She was to be with him, alone, at lunch. James Thomas returned promptly that afternoon. The couple sat wordlessly as they walked beyond the barracks to a grassy overlook of the harbor. Here and there the cropped grass was dotted with concrete tables. The conversation was stilted and formal. "Well, at last we get to be together," James announced, flapping the checkered tablecloth in the incessant wind. "Yes," Brenda said simply. "Thank you for inviting me." She moved mechanically, unloading the picnic basket. Brenda felt a surge of regret at this rendezvous. After all, who was this soldier? She remembered Tony, the lifeguard. That relationship had developed over many months, and their conversations were pleasant and uninvolved. Having seen her after only a few short weeks, this stranger had walked brazenly into her life. She sat next to James, her eyes lowered, methodically unwrapping the food. "What school do you go to?" James asked presently. "Kubasaki High," the girl returned. "You know, the only U.S. high school on the island." "Yeah, I went there my senior year. I graduated in '67. Brenda passed James a sandwich, then chewed hers slowly. "You mean you've been on this island for the past 4 years? Even Uncle Sam gives shorter tours than that." James laughed, his voice an agreeable chuckle that started low, then became 3 short, higher notes. "Not quite. 1968 was the last year of my dad's tour, and then the family moved stateside. I enlisted the month before they left, and I've been here ever since." Brenda whistled appreciatively. "You're a semi-native." "Native from Colorado, maybe. Until I was 6 years old, Dad was stationed at Lowry Air Force Base outside of Denver. He retired there last year after he made light colonel. Anyway, I'll go back sometime. I always loved the mountains." James' voice trailed off, his brilliant blue eyes reflecting the sky as he gazed at the low ridges before them. "These hills ain't nothing like home. The Rockies look like diamonds in winter." Silence descended again as James gazed reflectively at the squat, greenish hills beyond. Brenda ate quietly at his side, considering her folly. "I will be found out," she reasoned. "Somebody will tell. Then what will I say? What if Dad comes over that hill right now? What will he do?" She shuddered. James stabbed the air with a straw from his vanilla shake. "I'm sorry. This picnic was supposed to be for you. You're supposed to tell me all about yourself." Brenda waved him off, her hands fluttering like white doves. "We better eat. I've only got an hour." James swung a leg around the bench and stood, tall and tanned, in his green fatigue shirt. He lit a cigarette. "I've enjoyed lunch with you very much, Brenda Jean." Brenda remained silent. James was growing used to these intermissions. Obviously the girl was somewhat of a loner. It doesn't matter, James thought. She'll have a lot more company if I have anything to say about it. "Thank you for asking me," she replied at last, not daring to meet his gaze. His eyes crinkled with mirth at her answer. So shy. Why can't she carry on a simple, friendly conversation? James let his gaze travel slowly and admiringly, reflecting upon the platinum sheen in her long blonde hair lying across the generous shoulders. He liked the curve of her profile, tapering to a chin that was at once dainty and resolute. The symmetry of the face was perfect, save for a scar at the bridge of the nose. James' eye narrowed as he looked at the mark. Was this a clue to Brenda's mysterious past? I have to go," Brenda said, rising abruptly. "I have to get back to work now." "Can we have lunch again tomorrow?" "I suppose," Brenda replied, collecting the bags and crumbs from the meal. "Great! Then I'll meet you here, same time tomorrow, but I'll bring something more than burgers and fries." "Okay," Brenda said, nodding briefly. She turned abruptly and left him, walking easily up the hilly embankment. James could see the muscles in her legs work, as if toned by daily exercise. Again, an involuntary stirring in his loins reminded James that his interest was not entirely virginal. Yet he was not ashamed. He felt he had found a girl worthy of his love and his affection. "I gotta go," Brenda called out from the top of the hill, pointing at her watch. "Right," James called out, rising to his feet. Surely this was a woman worth courting. James wondered what her parents were like to have sired such a beauty. "I'll have to bring that up next time," he thought. Drawing one last time on his cigarette, he snubbed it out and walked down the hill to the car. Little by little, James earned a portion of Brenda's confidence. It did not happen immediately, but over a period of many meetings and many lunches in the park. Her trust was far from complete, however. James learned that one afternoon late in September, in the middle of a conversation. "I'm sorry about your girlfriend," Brenda had said quietly. "Don't be. She didn't have time for me, what with her office job and her second job at the PX. "I don't understand why people make promises they can't keep," Brenda said forcefully. "People should try to be true to each other, even though it isn't easy." Well said, her companion thought. James Thomas was no prude. He had brought many women to his bed with his devastating good looks, and he accepted that as a servicing of his physical needs. Still, he appreciated the beauty of Brenda's innocent belief. He too believed it. He did not like vapidity and sweetness and pretense. He admired spirit in a woman and self-reliance as well as beauty. He did not care for the common or the unintelligent, not even in a prostitute. For this reason, James found Brenda Campbell rivetingly attractive. His discerning eyes detected all these sterling qualities, subdued as they were. "Brenda Jean," James said, moving closer to her side, "I know that two people can be true to each other. I know it because my parents have that feeling. I hope that someday you and I might become friends, like my parents did before they married." James looked intently at Brenda's face, noting the misty eyes that she hid for a moment with the back of her hand. He reached out and touched her shoulder and part of her soft white neck. At James' touch, Brenda's entire frame went rigid. She turned on the boy with a look of utter hatred. "Don't ever touch me like that again," she said, with a steely voice and eyes that flashed with dark intent. James jerked his hand back as if he had been burned. He gaped, utterly astounded. "I'm sorry," he said, but he lied. "What in God's name did I say?" James thought, scanning his memory furiously. You'll have to excuse me," Brenda said, her tone softening immediately into an apology. "I get nervous when people touch me. It's a quirk of mine. I'm sorry." James blanched, unsure of what had just happened. It never happened to him before. He turned from Brenda, unwilling to show his anger. He stared out to sea, still numb with the ferocity of her response. "Damn it! I've seen moods before, but this is ridiculous." His own face had hardened, and he glared resolutely seaward, his eyes small, azure orbs. "I thought we had something in common, Brenda." James barely listened for an answer, his ears full of his own pounding heart. It was some time before he turned to find the bench was empty. Brenda had apologized profusely, but James refused to answer. She cursed herself as she gathered the remains of the lunch and walked back up the hill alone. James looked up in time to catch a glimpse of her receding form in the shimmering afternoon heat. He stared after her with a cold and remorseless expression, looking for an explanation that would not come. That afternoon, Brenda stared out of the car window, watching the evening traffic as her father wheeled the station wagon down Naha Boulevard. Why did I push James away? He only wanted to help me. Maybe I've lived alone so long I've forgotten what it's like to have a companion, just somebody to talk to. Once upon a time, Junior and I were friends, but not anymore. Now he's gone forever. Now James is gone too. Just as well. I would have been no good for him. Brenda despairingly ran her fingers through her hair. She contemplated the anguish in her life, her longing for love, for protection, for contentment, for a little beauty, a little surcease, a little quiet, a little privacy. There never will be privacy, no, not with that man in the seat next to me. There will be no quiet, not as long as Margot's house needs cleaning. Yesterday, the gym teacher had encouraged Brenda to join the gymnastics squad. Margot had turned her down flat. Brenda listened to the "you think I do as much for you as my own kids" speech, then went quietly back to her room. Tonight, there was the vacuuming to be done, the dinner to be fixed, dishes to be cleaned, washed, dried, and put away. Dusting. Maybe I can get everything done by 11 tonight, Brenda thought. There's a big chapter in biology on the test tomorrow. These thoughts crowded out the brief memories of James, until Brenda could only see a fleeting glimpse of that handsome face, receding into the outer reaches of her mind. He didn't need her. Brenda felt that perhaps this was not true, but the suspicion was there. Life was practical, she reasoned. Life is not a fairy tale. Oh yes, I'm very practical, she thought bitterly. I cook and clean and wash and wax so very well that someday I will become a passable waitress. That's really the only job a high school dropout can expect. Margot says I will probably drop out of school any day now because I'm so lazy. Yes, James will go away, and I will never see him again. Exhaustion swept over Brenda, exhaustion of the spirit and the body, and the awful hollowness of despair made her dizzy and weak. She leaned against the plastic upholstery of the car and closed her eyes gratefully against the glare of the evening sun. That night the housework was especially grueling. The vacuum cleaner moved grudgingly across the thin carpets. The dried food on the dishes refused to come off. Alan and Elizabeth screamed throughout the house, while Louis and Margot sat transfixed in front of the television set. Brenda wiped her forehead as she worked over the ironing board in the stifling kitchen. She heard a command from the TV room. "Brenda, bring me a beer, would you, baby?" She was almost glad to put down the iron to face the refreshing blast from the refrigerator. The itch in her eyes from Margot's cheap soap would be temporarily relieved. She brought Louis his beer. Now was her chance. This morning the PE teacher had asked Brenda again to go out for gymnastics. Brenda set the beer down next to her father. "Thanks, babe," he replied, looking up to her. Brenda's heart sank. Louis had that peculiar gleam in his eye. Tonight, he would be up to her room. What the hell, Brenda thought. "Dad?" "Yeah, babe?" "Miss Perkins, the PE teacher, said I ought to try out for the school gymnastics squad. They only practice 2 days a week. Would you sign my permission slip?" Louis looked up again. Their eyes met, and the agreement was as good as done. "Sure, babe. Go right ahead." Louis nodded, then returned his gaze to the television. "Whatever you want is okay by me." Brenda recognized the unspoken. He would have her, and now she had him. It was a simple transaction. "Thanks, Dad," Brenda replied. Brenda noticed with special relish the hateful look on Margot's face as Brenda returned to the sweltering kitchen. It was another hour before Brenda finished the ironing, but she hummed as she worked now. She barely noticed the heaviness in her legs as she carried the clothes basket upstairs. Brenda had been ironing since sunset. Now it was 9 o'clock. All that was left was to gather up the dirty clothes strewn from the upper rooms, evidence that Lawrence and Junior had returned home for the night. Brenda took the clothes downstairs, ready for washing. By 10, the housework was done. She retreated upstairs to her own airless bedroom. Brenda sat on the edge of her bed, her breath rasping from exertion. Her brilliant blonde hair was wet with perspiration and sticky against her shoulders. Her face was white with exhaustion. She automatically opened the biology book and scanned a chapter. Mentally, she went back over the review questions, but her vision ran many of the words together. The effort was too much. Brenda turned away, watching the green fluorescent hands of the bedside clock move soundlessly to midnight. In a daze, she pulled off her clothes and reached for a wrinkled nightgown. She fell on the bed and slept instantly. As if lying in wait, a large shadow appeared in the doorway. It was Louis. Again, Brenda had that awful dream of someone entering the room, an opaque apparition in the darkness. He would unzip and step out of his pants, then strip off his shirt, standing in the middle of the room nude. She would feel him bending over her, reaching for the hem of her garment. She would moan faintly in protest, but this only increased his desire. He wanted to devour her. There was a ferocity in his breathless examinations as his sweaty and probing hands searched the entire length of her body. It was as if he both hated and adored her. He would wind his fingers in Brenda's hair, and then, when she moaned in half-sleep, he would soothe her incoherently, crushing her body to his, almost smothering her. His body seemed to loom over hers without surcease. Eventually he would worm his way into her. Worm, yes, that was the word. Cruelly and relentlessly, like the cruel pine trees on Caucasia Ridge, worming their way through the thin shale and down to the countless dead from World War II, disturbed even in their final sleep by a force beyond their control, begun before they were born. Brenda would awaken at last. Her eyes were open, blank orbs, no longer aware of the day or night. The girl he raped that first time long ago had been nothing more than a child. She might have found it in her heart to forgive him, as daughters forgive their fathers most everything, for no more reason than the mindless love of a girl for her beloved daddy. Brenda never forgave her father for her profaned body. A dark, hard seed of evil had spawned in Brenda's heart, and Louis' visit to her room fed the evil until it poisoned not only her feelings for him, but had expanded to include the whole human race, especially and particularly men. Eventually, Louis removed his exhausted and panting form from his daughters, dressing and walking downstairs quietly in the eerie hush of the house. Brenda lay quiet and still amid the rumpled sheets. She did not bother to smooth her twisted nightdress, but lay in the darkness, expressionless, depleted. He had won again. Now she was awake. Why does he do this to me, Brenda thought. Still, he was her daddy. In the face of that logic, she lay silent, her eyes large and staring, every nerve taut from the experience, recording the sounds and fragrances that hung in the midnight air. She grew nauseated. She glanced at the dresser by her bed. There was a $20 bill where Louis had left it. Brenda turned away, her face glistening wet, and though she did not say the words, they were illuminated inside her mind. He pays me. God, he even pays me. Like a whore, Brenda thought to herself miserably, wiping tears on a pillow in the awful silence of her room. She could hear the faint wail of the airplanes landing at Naha Airfield, the rustling of the waves at Machinado Beach. In her room there was the pleasant ticking of the alarm clock and the sweet fragrance of honeysuckle that Louis had planted alongside the grape arbor out back. These were the few pleasant things in Brenda's bleak existence, but tonight the scent made her wretch. The chintz draperies swayed, pushed by a sluggish breeze. They had the shapes and distortions of agony. Brenda stared at the ceiling, and the face of James Thomas loomed out of the blackness. Brenda smiled bitterly as she recalled the picnic lunches behind the barracks and the fawn-like manner in which he gazed into her eyes. Who does he think he is to dare to touch me? He is a man, like my father, who only wants to get into my pants. Still, she shrank at the thought of James leaving her, of the delightful afternoons disappearing from her life, the oasis gone from a parched desert. There were times when Brenda longed to cry on James' shoulder, admitting all the guilt, all the fear, all the hatred, instead of holding it inside like an infection. She knew that one day it would kill her. The swaying curtains taunted the girl, whispering over and over, "You cannot have him. You're an intruder in his life. Leave him alone." The summer night was broken by her weeping, soundlessly and alone. James called the next day. "Would you like to have lunch tomorrow?" he said. Brenda cupped her hand over the mouthpiece of the phone, trying to hide the suspicion in her voice. "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure," James replied. "I'm sorry if I was pushy." He didn't add that he wasn't used to women turning him down flat. He listened carefully, trying to make adjustments to this new and very different woman. Brenda smiled broadly and hoped he could feel it over the phone. "No, James, it was my fault. I'm the one who should be sorry. It's just don't walk out on me again, okay?" Promptly at 12, James stepped into Brenda's office, his tall and sinewy form outlined in the doorway. Brenda waved shyly. She looked up into his deep-set eyes, his swarthy rectangular face, and let her gaze wander across the broad smile that accented his high cheekbones. Her eyes lingered at the long upper lip and the squared chin. "Hello, Brenda Jean," James said. "Hi." Oh, how she longed to say more than that. "Let's go. Remember, we've only got an hour." James wagged his finger in mock rebuke. Brenda fought the urge to close her eyes in a fit of fantasy, absorbing James' presence rather than observing it. She permitted herself the liberty of humming a gay little song, "We'll Sing in the Sunshine." She was so enraptured in James' visit that she did not conceal the thermos that she brought habitually to lunch now. James was in a talkative mood today, she could tell. "What do you like to do on the weekends?" James asked as they began the meal at the park. "Oh, I stay at home mostly," Brenda replied, prodding an ant at the table. James glanced down at her hands and made a mental note of their rough appearance, the chipped and broken nails. "Well, don't you go down to the beach with your family?" "My mom and dad used to take us to Boulder Creek all the time," James continued. "Terry, my brother, would chase me up and down the bank, playing war games, or Dad would pitch us in the water from his shoulders, and he would just roar with laughter when we sputtered and coughed." James noticed how she flinched when he mentioned his father. Very peculiar girl, he thought. James decided to drop this particular line of conversation. He sipped his Coke, then tried again. "Did you sign up for the cheerleader tryouts at the high school this fall? I bet you'd be good at it." "No. My parents don't have the money for the uniforms, but I go to the gym after school and work out on the parallel bars and the trampoline. It's lots of fun." Brenda tried to sound enthusiastic. She remembered the dreadful tongue-lashing she received from Margot when she brought the papers for the tryouts. "Are you trying to ruin our household budget with your silly shit, or just trying to find some excuse to meet boys, you little whore?" Margot always used the word whore when referring to Brenda. Why, Brenda thought, why? Brenda knew she was ugly. Margot had informed her of that fact ever since the girl was 10. Brenda seldom approached strangers of either sex at school, and the rest of the time she was at home doing the chores. James watched the girl's face as she spoke. Her lips did not turn up in a smile. The eyes did not twinkle at the remembrance of gym class. She could have been reading a newspaper. What was it about this girl that was at once so alluring and yet so cold? Everything about her fairly shouted. The beauty of her face, the shimmering of her hair, the voluptuousness of her figure. There was a division here, some schism in body and spirit James could not define. The real Brenda Jean appeared at odd moments behind the eyes, a darting spirit, then was gone. "Tell me about you, James. What are some of your favorite things?" James smiled in spite of himself. She had moved out of the spotlight again. Oh well. "I don't know," James said, dropping into his native Midwestern drawl. "I don't go hunting. Can't stand the thought of shooting a poor deer. My dad, he owns some acreage north of Pueblo, and I do a lot of fishing, but that's about all. Since I've been in the Army, I haven't been back to the States. I guess the old saying is right. There's no place like home." "Your home sounds beautiful, James," Brenda said. "I wish he would put his arms around me just for a minute," she thought. "I think everybody's home is special," James continued. "I'd like to see yours sometime." "No, I don't think you would." As she spoke, Brenda unscrewed the thermos and tilted the container. Her hands were shaking. Brenda sipped the thermos again. She did not see the imperceptible rise of James' eyebrow as he watched her raise the bottle. The muscles worked in his jaw. I don't think you'd like my house, Brenda said, wiping her mouth on a napkin. He makes me feel so sheltered and secure, she thought. We'll see, James said. His jaw worked again. She will make a beauty of a wife, he said inwardly. He had already estimated the size of ring her finger would require. Why don't I pick you up Friday afternoon after work? We can go hiking over at the ridge. Well, okay, I'll bring my jeans, and you can meet me here. Brenda did not want James to visit her parents' house. She wanted to keep this friendship longer than the others. I can stay out until dark.